If you had dealings with contracts in the 1990s and 2000s, you probably heard something called the LIBOR. And then this thing catastrophically failed because of a scandal which occurred. And now recently, we've had the US Congress pass a different rate which has replaced it called SOFR. And I don't think this is on a lot of people's radar. And it has some ramifications towards what Scott Bessent's plans are with respect to the US Treasury. Lucas, help me understand this. The SOFR replaced LIBOR. This happened in roughly 2012. And then in 2022, that's the timeline around which this replacement interest rate has come into play.
Okay, LIBOR, 2012 was whenever there was a LIBOR scandal, and that scandal brought attention in the world of finance to how the LIBOR rate was being set. LIBOR was an agreement between various banks in London as to what a short-term lending rate was to be, and then that was that agreement between a couple of those banks in London began to be used around the world for things, like variable rate mortgages. What is the variable rates to be? So in 2012, people began to question how it was set, and that was the scandal. There wasn't a lot of immediate impact, sort of Bernie Madoff style culprits, etc., that were pegged, but the question became afterwards, well, isn't there a better way to do this? And who is in control of this variable rate mortgage? And the United States really began to think about this and say, well, why are we using London banks? We use dollars throughout the world. The generation of dollars is largely here inside the United States. We have set up financial systems, the IMF, the World Bank, to distribute those dollars throughout the world. But have we forgotten something here? And is this a leak in the system that's being abused by other banks in order to take advantage of especially asset holders around the world, people who are paying for their homes, paying for cars, or otherwise taking out other loans. So that all happened in 2012. In 2022, after years of study and consideration with regards how to fix it, the United States began to implement this new rate they call SOFR, or Secured Overnight Finance Rate. And in 2022, March 15th, Congress directed the Federal Reserve to begin to implement it. And in 2023, the Federal Reserve had made SOFR its benchmark rate rather than LIBOR. It had replaced LIBOR with the SOFR rate. And so in the last couple of years, the last 2 years, trillions and trillions of dollars worth of contracts have been moved over into the SOFR benchmark instead of the LIBOR benchmark. And the SOFR rate is controlled by not the Federal Reserve, but by the United States Treasury. And there's an empirical...
That seems pretty significant, that there's somewhat of a decoupling here between the U.S. government, which has been largely utilizing the Federal Reserve in many ways as their bank, to taking back some of that control through the U.S. Treasury. Is that significant? Am I thinking about that right?
Absolutely. I think that might be the most significant thing for us to be thinking about, because, if we think about how the Federal Reserve came to be, how it operates with autonomy from the government, how it's not truly a central bank, but a private bank that is given a monopoly by the United States federal government. And we've long heard these calls of end the Fed, but the question that was always lurking, if we end the Fed, what pops up behind it? And do we want a central bank like other countries, like France and well, especially France, have used? Do we want to try to go back to to free banking or unregulated banking like we have in the history of the United States. If we do so, is the free banking going to be monopolized into something that looks like the Federal Reserve, and are we going to be again saddled with a central bank that is controlled by other interests like a London banking cartel? And I think those were the thoughts that were put into this SOFR rate, and why the control of it was given over to the United States Treasury. And then if we look at the theatrics between Donald Trump and the Federal Reserve, whether it be Lisa Cook or Jerome Powell, I think we begin to understand that that they are creating a theater to sort of, I say they, especially Donald Trump and maybe Jerome Powell, are creating a theater to begin to illuminate some of the problems of the independence of the Federal Reserve. But meanwhile, that's not as important, or is the importance of that has been lessened because there have already been steps taken to give the Federal Reserve some of, or I'm sorry, to give the United States Treasury greater latitude to act more like a central bank, but yet one that is controlled. And I'm thinking too about the stable genius acts, the stable coins that the United States Treasury will now be in control of. Also, so all that aside, because I don't want to get too deeply in the weeds of the Trump administration's relationship with the Federal Reserve, or to dwell too much on the Federal Reserve. I also find it interesting because as I began thinking about this, I said, I know vaguely that Scott Bessent, who Trump selected as the treasurer, the secretary for the Treasury, had something to do with the shorting of the British pound back in 1992. And that had just been, a factoid to file away about Scott Bessent. I had seen some of the
this is an interesting guy because he was working with George Soros. He actually caught some resistance because of his association with George Soros, that he's not well liked in the Republican Party. George Soros is the one who has been accused of funding a lot of the activities that the Republicans have said are anti-American and in helping the Democrats and whatever they've been doing. So having an association with George Soros is not something that endeared him to the Republicans.
Absolutely. And I know also vaguely of George Soros. I understand that, and maybe I agree with the manipulation that George Soros is able to bear on the political processes in various countries and the United States through his Open Societies Foundation. I do find that problematic, but I include all incredibly rich people who are able to give grand donations to politicians in that regard. So that's and I think MAGA sometimes maybe gives a pass to maybe the Elon Musks or other rich people who are trying to influence our political processes. So, that aside, I wanted to get more deeply into what occurred with the shorting of the pound and why, because, as the United States,
this was the Black Wednesday event that we're talking about now, that Scott Bessent was involved in with George Soros, where they started to note that there was a weakness that could be exploited in the way that the UK currency was set up.
Yes. And I wanted, because I had an assumption made that if Donald Trump had selected Scott Bessent, it wasn't because he was because Donald Trump was looking to figure out how to run away with a lot of cash by manipulating the American finance or the United States financial system. I had an idea that Scott Bessent had some sort of knowledge and experience with foreign currencies, and that Donald Trump was looking for somebody who could navigate the United States, the dollar system, through the phase of multipolarity that we're going throughout the world. And not just that phase of multipolarity, but also figure out some sort of way to manage the massive debt that the United States has accumulated throughout. Well, in trying to continue to keep the dollar as being used by the rest of the world. And I thought, well, Scott Bessent must have some ideas. So start looking into Scott Bessent's history, and I got I went directly to Black Wednesday because I thought possibly this was going to have a lot to inform it. One, he was very young in his career when it happened, but also just because the nature of this crisis. And I listened to a couple of interviews that Scott Bessent gave, and not only Scott Bessent, but also Stan Druckenmiller. Scott Bessent was a deputy. He was working with a man named Stan Druckenmiller, who had targeted this vulnerability in the British pound back in 1992. And what they say, and there are great interviews with both of them in which they talk about it. These Real Vision accounts on YouTube interviews. So what they say is that Margaret Thatcher had taken a policy of home ownership in Britain. And if you think back to Margaret Thatcher days, this was coming out of sort of the social democracy policies of Asquith and others. And Margaret Thatcher was sort of a far right nationalist of her day, an early Trump, and part of her policies had been to get British people into their homes, but turn around and there was a vulnerability in the variable.
Well, and that home ownership is different than how the United States does it. And I think it's different than how Canada does it because they're a British protectorate or whatever, is that the lending rate isn't fixed for 30 years the way that it traditionally is in the United States, or even 15 years. They're all variable rate mortgages. So your rate is constantly changing based on whatever the London Central Bank wants it to be.
Yes. And I'm not familiar with all of those details, but what Stan Druckenmiller and Scott Bessent both say is that that financial woes of the pound sterling were being exported onto the backs of the mortgage holders, and that was being manipulated through the variable mortgage rate. And so they figured out a way to force the Bank of England into admitting, because they may have made a lot of money, but what they did was force the Bank of England into a position where it was having to pay extraordinary amounts of money, to a point at which it became obvious that they had been leaning on the variable rate mortgage to extract more money from mortgage holders inside the UK. And so to then fast forward to what was happening with the LIBOR rate, we have this notion that America is in control of the dollars and the institutions around the world, but we haven't thought about what was happening with debt instruments, with mortgages, and who was in control of mortgages, and why those rates were being set as to what they were. And I think that the United States has corrected that leak outside the system, or that leak outside of the American institutions, and said, okay, now that we have standardized the secured variable mortgage rate, we're not going to have such a problem of, say, London banks being under stress and turning towards manipulating the rate of all of these debt instruments, so that they can relieve that stress, export it onto people who are paying for their homes. And then when I look at the Trump's policies with regards to tariffs, I think now the architects of the financial system, especially the dollar financial system, have realized that if they plug that hole, then they can have a greater deal. They can have a greater amount of control over the asset values around the world. And
that seems like a key point. So if the asset values are tied to an interest rate that is controlled by the U.S. Treasury, then this is a lever that could potentially be used. But I mean, it seemed like the whole point of the SOFR was to set it up algorithmically so that it couldn't be manipulated in this way. Is there some kind of mechanism where the U.S. Treasury is then getting a piece of the action, or like I'm not sure how I understand how this is helping the U.S. Treasury, other than maybe to not be beholden to some foreign bankers that are doing something that may not be necessarily on the up and upper in the best interest of people that are pegging their contracts to this international bank rate.
Well, this is where I think the Stablecoin Act becomes so interesting, because if the United States Treasury also now has stablecoins that they can distribute to various countries throughout the world, and they're also in control of the variable interest rate on the debts or the mortgages that are being paid for houses, then they've stopped a leak. They can distribute money to the various countries of the world, and instead of that money being soaked up by the banks and winding up in London, winding up in Elliott Capital Management, et cetera, then we can expect to see the asset values of property and maybe even jobs, cars, whatever it may be, rising throughout the world. And I think that has not been, you might think that the United States distributing cash to all the world, magically printing it and giving it out to world leaders would have led to that happening in the past. But no, what that led to was making incredibly rich people who kept it isolated from everything else, so that they were suppressing the price of resources, the price of land, the price of property, the price of labor in these various countries around the world. And Donald Trump, Peter Navarro, Scott Bessent have been very adamant that this system leads to security instability, that it leads to a disparity in the livelihoods of people around the world, and that has had catastrophic effects for the world. This is why they say we live in constant warfare. And if we're going to fix this, there's been a narrative within the United States of Donald Trump is going to bring down the price of eggs. Donald Trump is going to bring down the price of groceries. Oh, there is an impending collapse of the price of houses that have risen so dramatically since 2008 and 2009, since that collapse. But I don't think that's what their plan is here. What they would like to do is to secure these tariffs, or secure these trade agreements with various countries around the world, and then inflate their asset prices to rise to parity with the United States. And that will avoid the catastrophic collapses in society that happen whenever prices go down, because it takes so long for people to refigure out what they're willing to work for, or what the value of something is whenever whenever you have to restart and rebuild those systems. And so I think this is the Trump plan for how we're going to pay off the national debt. is to do so through tariffs, but the other part of it is the tariffs are not at these depressed, are not going to be based on these depressed prices of assets in other countries of the world. We're going to try to raise the asset prices, the economies around the world.
So prices getting raised, that seems like we're talking about a massive worldwide inflation event. Is that what we should be expecting? Is suddenly the prices of everything goes up very substantially in the entire planet? Is that what's on the horizon then? That sounds pretty dramatic.
So with inflation, everyone talks about prices. I'm always, this comes from the price theory of money. Focus on the price. Focus on the price. We can be in a swimming pool and we can look at each other and say nobody's drowning, but without accounting for how much water is in the pool, and what what we all have little floaties on. This is the price. This is the price mechanism of money. While the pool has been filled up, and now we're in some flooded massive world. So Donald. And I just say that because there's also the supply of money. The supply of money is very important. And this also begins to question, where does money come from? There's this narrative that the Fed is the place that prints money. In reality, when we think about it, money is printed by all sorts of banks, and it's based on the rise of the understanding of what the price for all these assets that you can take loans out on is around the world. And in one part, the first place that most people jump to in regards to that is our houses, but it is also our jobs. The most basic asset that everyone has is the ability to work and to be employed. And when we begin to think about how governments are structuring their countries, that's the tool that they jump to first. So when the Trump administration is talking about raising asset values, I think the number one asset that they're concerned about are people's jobs. And they're not pigeonholed by this price theory of money. And this price theory of money has been perpetuated by the leak in the interest rates through which the financial industries were taking all the money. Let's go back and think about our conversation about quantitative easing. The United States was creating a lot of money at the level of the Federal Reserve, and then paying financial institutions and rich people to hold on to that money instead of lending it out. This is exactly the wrong way to be structuring economies. We should be giving the money out at the base level to the workers through their jobs or through their property, and then letting capitalism, fair market capitalism, let fair market capitalism play out from there. But because what we've seen through this price theory of money and controlling the prices of things to maintain some sort of stability is just the rise of a world oligarchy. And Trump and Scott Bessent, one of the very first things that I heard Scott Bessent say when he was questioned about the Trump tariff policies, he said, "I'm not interested in securing the financial futures of the richest people in the world." He said, I'm worried about Main Street America. I'm worried about blue collar workers. I'm worried about people in their homes. And that's something that we should be much more worried about. And the reporter was dubious as to his response. And he said, "You're towing the line of the richest people in the world. And when the richest people in the world are complaining, we ought to be questioning about why they're complaining and why we're listening to their complaints rather than the working poor throughout the world."
So one of the things that I'm still trying to wrap my head around with SOFR and LIBOR is the broad utilization of this externally Is LIBOR still being used, or is this SOFR rate like largely replacing this internationally? Is this, you said that there were a lot of contracts that were being rewritten this way. Is this also being widely adopted in the UK? Did they take on SOFR as well, or are they clinging to LIBOR? It wasn't clear whether this is just completely gone or if just the scandal started to change things in the United States.
I listened also to a couple of interviews with some of the architects of SOFR, including the 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 lead input from the Federal Reserve of New York. And it seemed to me, and I don't have that link to give you, and I don't remember his name, but it seemed to me that this was being adopted very broadly. Now, I'm not sure about within the UK. I would say that the UK might have political incentive to try to be forcing the continued use of LIBOR within the UK and within the Commonwealth countries. But I think that institutions around the world are going to be more attracted to the empirical and open establishment of that rate, rather than the closed door nepotism rate of a method of the LIBOR rate. So I think, and I saw, I'm not sure how much or what the value of derivatives contracts throughout the world are, but I saw, or the New York Point guy said that in the first year, I believe it was $200 trillion worth of contracts had been moved over from LIBOR to SOFR. So, and I also, well, I don't know if I can answer in any more detail about that, but I wanted to also maybe draw our attention to some of the Trump administration's moves with regard to gold, silver, and oils, not just their tariff policies, if we have time for that.
I think we do. So this has been something that's been occurring where some of the gold that was held externally, or that a lot of gold and silver and assets are being returned to the United States. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, well, the Trump administration, one of the first things that we saw happen even before Trump was inaugurated was that American banks, and God knows what customer, but I'm beginning to think maybe the United States Treasury had demanded the physical delivery of gold, and they had been purchasing that gold on the London Exchange, and very quickly had emptied out London of their physical gold, and that that system there is one of generally the number I've seen is that there were 100 paper contracts that were leveraged against every 1 ounce of gold, and the United States, instead of playing their game of spots and futures that goes perpetually on, had decided to just cash out and physically take the gold. And now we're seeing that occur with silver too. I've seen reports that for the physical delivery of silver now in London, they are 6 years behind what's possible to be mined and processed by the likes of Hecla and Alcoa and other mining companies around the world. And I see narratives from gold bugs of, oh, we're returning to the gold standard, we're returning to the silver standard. I think this is more complex. I don't know why the United States would want to go back to the gold or silver standard.
Well, one thing I'd say to silver, I know that the industrial use of silver has gone up pretty dramatically. I believe that the creating solar panels has some demand on physical silver, that it's used as a component there, and so the physical demands on silver are going up from an industrial perspective, as well as some of this taking delivery of physical metals. So I think there's maybe two forces at play that are happening with silver.
Well, I think that has something to do with it, but I think the motivation of the Trump administration and the banks in the United States is not it does not have to do with that sort of expectation of the use of silver increasing dramatically. I think it has to do with an understanding about these moves that the Trump administration is making and wanting to close off some of the asset classes um, that the London banks might try to use in order to perpetuate their existence or to forestall some sort of coming collapse. And so I think there were calculated moves to move in and take the most valuable asset class, gold, move on to silver, um, and then uh, through the tariff deals and trade arrangements that are made throughout the world, to try to give the United States resiliency, access, secure some sort of access to various resources, whether it be oil or rare earth metals, with other countries around the world, and without any foreign banks or foreign financial institutions having anything but liquidity to add to that contract, to take them out of control of any of the rates. And I think these are the plays that the Trump administration has been making. And with the sort of political battle that's coming with regards to the emergency tariff powers that Trump has been exercising to secure those deals, I think that the Trump administration probably expected that political battle to happen and had been trying to make these moves within the window of time that they could expect. The month of times that they could expect before that legal challenge um, uh, took the fore here inside the United States. So I do believe that we are going to see.
Right, because what we're talking about here is the tariffs that were enacted by Trump have been challenged in some sense, because these aren't necessarily the way that tariffs were intended to be levied, but rather there's an emergency component to the tariffs that is allowed to be exercised by the president under certain circumstances. Some have said that Trump is abusing this and that there may be an attempt in Congress to rein this in. There's probably not the votes in Congress, and the legal challenge would then be the route that would have to be taken. I don't know what happened with that legal challenge. Did you see anything there? I know that at least some parts of the judiciary have taken up consideration of this.
I think we're expecting a ruling sometime this week, maybe next week. But we've also seen Donald Trump, to the consternation of MAGA, turning and attacking the likes of Thomas Massie and Rand Paul. And it's so very interesting that those are the fiscally conservative members of Congress the most. And yet I think Donald Trump looks at them and says, these libertarians who want to end the Fed are going to trap us in the control of private banks outside of the United States. We don't want to go that route. And I think the Trump administration also looks at Congress and says, oh, the problem that we've had in the past is that we have, we don't have the feedback loop of one person being able to quickly make decisions to establish some of these trade deals. And so this gets shunted off into Congress. And again, we have a vulnerability towards free trade, and that free trade being the piggyback of external and foreign interests, leading American politicians to chasing the least common denominator instead of the greatest common factor, I guess might be a way to phrase it, in establishing trade relations for the United States. And I think they see this as a problem, which has led to the liberal globalism that the United States has participated in for so long. So I think this was there are many aspects of this that were planned out by the Trump administration in order to try to redirect America's commercial relationships with other countries around the world. And I think we're very shortly going to see if they hold. And I think that the the tariff challenges and the ability of the Trump administration to not just maintain these new tariffs or in trade relations with other countries of the world, but also if they're going to start making returns to the United States. If the Trump administration is able to get rid of the IRS and the federal income tax, I think that might also be a card they're waiting to play, a card they're waiting to put on the table leading into the upcoming midterms. Because I think that's the card that would bring them a lot of voters back to their table, and convince them that they are taking the right path for the future of Americans.
Interesting things to think about. I'll definitely have to read up a bit more on SOFR and hopefully have a chance to check out these YouTube videos. I watched one of them, and I'm eager to see this next one that you pointed out. So we'll definitely be checking that out. I think that's all the time we've got. So we'll see you next time on FOMO.